Hello, I'm Myla Neal. I'm completing my assignment 3.1 for the Capstone course for Communications Voice Thread Presentation. The concept that I've chosen is the agentic shift concept from the administrative ethics class that I took earlier in the MPA program. I am not an expert in this field, as I'm sure many scientists are not an expert in this field either, but I found it a very interesting concept that we learned about in administrative ethics. I chose it just to discuss it a little bit further, and my intended audience is just another group of MPA students who might be interested in discussing this topic further. So that is the intended use of this discussion. So, agentic shift comes from the Milgram experiments, which we learned about several times throughout the course of the MPA courses, but specifically in the ethics course. So, agentic shift is when a person goes from being an individual and accepting responsibility and thinking as an individual to assuming less responsibility because they feel as though they're taking orders from a superior or a person in authority. And so they go from being an individual who thinks and feels and takes responsibility for individual actions to being just an agent of a greater body or an agent of a superior or person in authority. And the result of this is the individual pretty much assumes no responsibility for their actions or very little. It's the I'm just taking orders or I was just following orders excuse. And so this is why I thought that this concept was so interesting in the class. Ethics was one of my favorite classes in the MPA program, probably because I feel ethics is so important to any person's job, but specifically is government administrators. It's imperative that we, participate in ethics discussions, we go through ethics training, and we try every day to make ethical decisions and set the standard for ethical behavior because we are under such scrutiny and because we are the agents of the government, back to that agentic shift, but also we're responsible to every citizen that we serve. And so it's important that as government administrators, we do not participate in these groupthink activities where we pretty much release ourselves of any individual responsibility. So in the experiments, there was a person in a gray lab coat that would give orders to the participant in the experiments to administer shocks or volts of electricity to another person. At the end of the experiments, they determined that people were more likely to give higher voltages when they're instructed to, and even more likely to do that if the person was in another room, if the instructor was in another room where they did not feel they had the same responsibility for the pain they were causing the other person if the instructor was not in the room with them. So there are a couple of parts of this agentic shift that are very important to note. Number one is the legitimate authority figure that they all assume that they had with the person in the gray lab coat, which is what happens a lot of times in several examples over history of where people claim they were just following orders when they committed evil acts or participated in atrocities. The most famous example, of course, is going to be the Nazis, and during the Nuremberg trials, everyone who's on trial pretty much says, I was just following orders. Then, later on in history, the United States participated in a version of that with the Japanese internment camps. And so Lieutenant DeWitt convinced people that the Japanese were just as dangerous as any other enemy. And so as a country, we participated in interning Japanese people during World War II. And it may have been motivated out of fear, but there were several people who basically gave up that individual responsibility to participate in that, which again goes back to the agentic shift. The My Lai incidents from Vietnam, and then most recently, the largest scandal that was publicized for months was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal. And their poster child was Lindy England, the female officer who participated in all the picture taking, plus the abuse and the humiliation of the prisoners. And Lindy herself even said, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong. Now, had she been on her own, and that was just a passerby that she saw on the street, I doubt she would have participated in any of those things. But because she was part of this isolated group of people in a very specific environment, her superiors were encouraging this type of behavior and participating in it themselves. She went from being an individual who probably had her own set of morals, standards, and ethics to part of a group whose moral standard and ethics had degenerated over the time they spent in the prison. So these are the examples I'm using. There are several of them throughout history, like I said. But choosing not to question people is the first step towards this compliance, and that's why it's important as government agents and government administrators that we question decisions. So why do people obey is my little graphic that I have here. So the first part of that is gradual commitment, having committed to one course of action, like the shocks and the Milgram experiments. Once you do it the first time, it becomes easier to do it the next time, and your responsibility seems to dwindle as you do it repeatedly. The agentic shift that we talked about, where you can put the blame onto someone else that was just following orders, and the role of buffers, like the person not being in the room from the experiment. So as soon as the instructor was outside the room, that responsibility started to diminish. If the instructor was in the room with them, they could see the pain, and that's why they did not administer as many shocks. So just the importance of this concept is that we as individuals have to still think as ourselves, make decisions as ourselves, and when we see questionable behavior in the workplace, we must question it. We must identify areas that we don't believe are right and not fall into the trap of groupthink in the agentic shift. And so that's the concept that I would plan to discuss with another group of MPA students. Thank you for your time and attention.